Before there were predators, there was nothing to be afraid of. That sounds like a peaceful thought. But the world that existed before the age of hunters was not peaceful in any sense we would recognize. It was alien. It was silent in ways that are hard to imagine. And it was ruled not by teeth and claws, but by chemistry and time. To understand the first great predators of Earth, you first have to understand the world they came from. A world without eyes, without mouths, without anything that moved with purpose. For the first 4 billion years of Earth's existence, roughly the first 80% of this planet's entire history, life existed, but it was simple, almost beyond description. Bacteria and single-celled organisms coated the floors of shallow seas. They formed mats and domes of layered rock called stromatolites, which are still found in a few places on Earth today. These living mats were doing something extraordinary. They were quietly, over billions of years, pumping oxygen into the atmosphere. They were changing the chemistry of the world, and eventually that changed world would make complex life possible. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe. It really helped this channel going. Around 600 million years ago, something shifted. The first multicellular animals appeared, creatures made not of one cell, but of many cells working together. These are called the Ediacaran organisms, named for the hills in Australia, where some of the best fossils were found, were soft-bodied, strange, and mostly passive. Some looked like fronds or leaves, others like discs or blobs pressed into ancient seafloor mud. None of them had eyes. None had mouths in any recognizable sense. They drifted or sat still and absorbed nutrients from the water around them. They were alive, but barely in any way we would recognize as living. Then, roughly 540 million years ago, everything changed. Geologists call it the Cambrian Explosion, and that name is apt. In a geological eye blink, perhaps 10 million years. It sounds long, but it's tiny on the scale of Earth's history. The world went from simple and passive to complex and dangerous. Animals with eyes appeared. Animals with shells appeared. Animals with legs appeared. And with all of these innovations came something new to the history of life on Earth. Something that would define the story of animals from that moment forward. Predation, the act of one living thing, hunting, killing, and eating another. The Cambrian Explosion was not just an explosion of diversity, it was an explosion of arms races. The moment the first predator appeared, every other creature in the ocean faced a new and urgent problem: how to survive being eaten. So pre-evolved shells and spines and the ability to flee. And predators evolved better eyes, better claws, better jaws, and greater speed. Each improvement in attack prompted a new improvement in defense. Each new defense prompted a new improvement in attack. This back and forth, this endless evolutionary arms race is one of the most powerful forces in the history of life. It began in the Cambrian. It has never stopped. The seas of the Cambrian were warm and shallow, spread across a world that was geographically unrecognizable. There were no continents in any familiar sense. The land was largely bare rock and sand, untouched by plant life, baking under a sun whose light hit the surface without any leaf or blade of grass to intercept it. All the action was in the water, and what action it was. The Cambrian oceans were filled with bizarre, experimental creatures, animals whose body plans were so unusual that they have no living relatives. Animals that evolution tried once and then discarded. Animals that look, in the fossil record, like the sketches of a world still figuring out what it wanted to be. Among all these creatures, one stood apart. It was bigger than anything else in this world. It was faster. It was more capable. It had complex eyes that could spot prey from a distance, grasping appendages at the front of its body for seizing victims, and a circular, tooth-ringed mouth for crushing what it caught. Its name is Anomalocaris, which means abnormal shrimp. A name given before scientists understood quite what they were looking at. It was not a shrimp. It was the first great predator in the history of animal life. and it was extraordinary. Anomalocaris could grow to around a meter in length, possibly more. In a world where most animals were measured in centimeters, that made it a giant. It swam using a series of flexible lobes along its sides, rippling them in waves to move through the water with surprising speed and maneuverability. Its eyes were compound, like those of a modern fly or dragonfly, made up of thousands of individual lenses. Scientists who have studied those fossilized eyes estimate that they were among the sharpest visual organs of the entire Cambrian period. Anomalocaris did not blunder into its prey. It saw them, targeted them, and moved to take them. Its victims were the trilobites, hard-shelled, many-legged creatures that crawled across the seafloor in their millions and were among the most successful animals of their time. Trilobites had evolved their shells partly as defense, and for many predators, those shells were protection enough. But the circular mouth of Anomalocaris was reinforced with hard plates that could apply crushing force. Fossilized trilobites have been found with bite marks that match perfectly with the mouth of Anomalocaris. The evidence is unambiguous. This creature hunted, and it killed. And it left its mark on its victims in ways that survived 500 million years of geological time. What makes Anomalocaris so significant is not just what it was, but what it represented. It was the first apex predator, the first animal to sit at the very top of a food chain, the first creature to kill without being killed, the first hunter that nothing else hunted in return. Every apex predator that has existed since every great white shark, every lion, every Tyrannosaurus rex is in some sense a descendant of the idea that Anomalocaris first brought into the world. The idea of the top predator, the idea of the animal that nothing else dares to challenge. It started here in the warm Cambrian seas 500 million years ago. After the Cambrian came the Ordovician period, and beginning around 485 million years ago, and the seas of the world grew richer and stranger with every passing million years. Life was diversifying at a pace that had never been seen before. Coral reefs were forming for the first time. Mollusks were spreading across the seafloor. Fish, the first vertebrates, the first animals with backbones, were appearing in the shallow coastal waters, small and jawless and not yet the dominant force they would one day become. And in the waters, alongside all of these new creatures, something was growing, something armored and fast and deeply dangerous. The sea scorpions were coming. The Eurypterids, to give them their proper scientific name, were not true scorpions. They were arthropods, members of the same great group that includes crabs, spiders, and insects, but they were something altogether more formidable than any of those. They had segmented bodies, 6 pairs of limbs, and a long tapering tail that in some species ended in a spike. Their front limbs were modified into powerful claws or paddles depending on the species. Some were built for speed in open water, swimming with paddle-like rear limbs. Others were built for ambush, lurking in the shallows and seizing prey with grasping claws. They were varied, adaptable, and enormously successful. The earliest Eurypterids were modest in size, perhaps 30 centimeters long, comparable to a large lobster. But over millions of years, as the Ordovician gave way to the Silurian period around 443 million years ago, some lineages began to grow and grow and grow. The Silurian seas, warm and full of food, were an environment that rewarded size. A larger body meant you could take larger prey. A larger body meant fewer things could threaten you. And so, some Eurypterids became truly enormous in a way that challenges belief when you first encounter the fossil evidence. Pterygotus was one of the largest. It grew to around 2.5 meters in length, the size of a large crocodile. It had enormous claws at the front of its body, serrated like steak knives, designed for seizing and holding struggling prey. Its eyes were large and forward-facing, giving it good depth perception for judging the distance to a target. It was a pursuit predator, built for speed in open water capable of rapid acceleration when it spotted something worth eating. In the Silurian seas, where fish were still relatively small and poorly armored, Crocodile-Sized was essentially untouchable. Nothing hunted it. Everything else was potential food. Jaekelopterus was even larger. Fossil claws belonging to this creature suggest a total body length of perhaps 2.5 meters, possibly approaching 3. If that estimate is correct, and there is genuine scientific debate about it, then Jaekelopterus was the largest arthropod that has ever lived. Larger than any crab or lobster alive today. It's larger than most sharks. It's a creature of that size, moving through shallow coastal waters with its grasping claws extended and its compound eyes scanning for prey, would have been a genuinely terrifying presence in its world. What is remarkable about the sea scorpions is not just their size, but their adaptability. While many Eurypterids remained purely marine, some lineages began to venture into freshwater environments. Some may even have been capable of spending short periods on land, using their limbs to drag themselves across mudflats between water bodies, much as some modern crabs do today. This was an extraordinary development. The land in the Silurian and early Devonian was not yet hospitable to large animals. The plant life covering was still sparse and low, but the Eurypterids were beginning to explore its edges. Life was testing the boundary between water and land, and the sea scorpions were among its advanced scouts. Their prey in these years were diverse. Trilobites were still abundant and formed a major part of the diet for many Eurypterid species. Early fish, still small and jawless, were vulnerable to attack from these armored giants. Mollusks, brachiopods, and other seafloor creatures would have been taken by the slower, more bottom-dwelling Eurypterid species. The seas of the Silurian were complex, multi-layered ecosystems, and the Eurypterids occupied many different positions within them, some as pursuit predators in open water, some as ambush hunters in the shallows, some as bottom-crawling scavengers and opportunists. The reign of the sea scorpions lasted an extraordinarily long time. They first appeared around 460 million years ago and persisted all the way to the end of the Permian period. 252 million years ago, a run of over 200 million years, is longer than the entire age of dinosaurs. In that time, they survived multiple mass extinctions, adapted to changing seas, and maintained their position as significant predators across a vast span of geological time. They are not as famous as the dinosaurs. They do not appear in blockbuster films. In terms of longevity and success, few groups of animals in the history of life can match them. By the time the sea scorpions were declining, the world had changed dramatically around them. Fish had developed jaws, a revolution in animal biology as significant as any in the history of life. Jawed fish could bite and chew in ways that jawless fish could not, and they diversified explosively as a result. The seas were filling with new and formidable competitors. The land was being colonized by plants and then by animals. The Eurypterids were no longer the unchallenged kings of the waters. Something new was taking their crown, and that something was a fish unlike anything that had come before. It was armored from head to mid-body in thick, bony plates. It had no teeth, but it did not need them. It had bone blades sharp enough to cut through almost anything. It was enormous, the largest predatory animal of its era, and when it opened its mouth, it did so not just by dropping its lower jaw, but by lifting its entire skull upward, creating a gape so vast that almost nothing in the Devonian Sea could escape it. Its name was Dunkleosteus, and the age of the sea scorpions was giving way to the age of the armored fish. The Devonian period lasted from about 419 to 359 million years ago, and it is sometimes called the Age of Fishes. That name is well earned. During the Devonian, fish diversified into an astonishing variety of forms, colonized almost every aquatic environment on Earth, produced some of the most spectacular predators that have ever lived in water. It was a period of extraordinary biological creativity, a time when evolution was experimenting boldly with the basic vertebrate body plan, pushing it in directions that would shape the future of all backboned life, including, eventually, us. The key innovation that drove this explosion was the jaw. Before jaws evolved, fish were passive filter feeders, or suction feeders, unable to bite and hold prey in the way that later vertebrates could. The evolution of jaws derived in a twist that still astonishes biologists, from the gill arches that supported the gills of jawless ancestors, transformed what a fish could do. A fish with jaws could seize prey actively. It could bite off pieces of food too large to swallow whole. It could defend itself by biting back. The jaw was one of the most consequential evolutionary inventions in the history of animal life. The Devonian is where it first showed its full potential. Among all the jawed fish of the Devonian, one group stood apart for their sheer imposing physical presence: the Placoderms, or armored fish. The Placoderms had evolved heavy, bony armor covering their heads and the front portion of their bodies, fused into a rigid shield that protected their vital organs. This armor was not just defensive in some species, it also served as a rigid frame against which the jaw muscles could pull, allowing the generation of enormous bite forces. Placoderms came in many sizes and forms, from small bottom dwellers to open ocean hunters. And at the top of this group, in terms of size and ferocity, sat Dunkleosteus. Pterygotus, to give it its full name, was discovered in the late 19th century in the fossil beds of Ohio and surrounding areas, where its bones had been preserved in ancient seafloor sediments for 380 million years. What the fossils showed was staggering. The armored head and shoulder shield alone, in the largest specimens, measures around 90 centimeters, extrapolating from the head-to-body ratios of related species. Researchers have estimated total body lengths of up to 9 or 10 meters for the very largest individuals. That is the length of a large, great white shark. And Dunkleosteus was probably heavier, its bony armor adding substantial mass. The skull of Dunkleosteus is one of the most remarkable structures in the fossil record. It's opened in an unusual way, not just by dropping the lower jaw, as most animals do, but simultaneously by lifting the entire cranium upward, rotating at a joint at the back of the skull. This mechanism, combined with the downward movement of the lower jaw, created a gape that could open with extraordinary speed. Studies using computer modeling of the jaw mechanics suggest that Dunkleosteus could fully open his jaws in around 50 milliseconds, faster than the human eye can follow. The resulting suction drew water and prey into its mouth before they had time to react. And then the blades came into play. Dunkleosteus had no teeth, none at all. Instead, the edges of its jawbones were sharpened into blade-like ridges of bone, self-sharpening as the upper and lower blades slid past each other with each bite. Scientists who have modeled the bite force of Dunkleosteus estimated at around 5,000 newtons at the tip of the jaw, comparable to or exceeding the bite force of modern crocodilians, which are famous for the power of their jaws. Dunkleosteus could bite through the armor of other placoderms. It could bite through almost anything alive in the Devonian Sea. The world that Dunkleosteus ruled was the warm, shallow sea that covered much of what is now North America, Europe, and North Africa during the Devonian. This sea, sometimes called the Devonian Epicontinental Sea, was rich in life. Cephalopods with coiled shells swam in open water. Sharks, smaller and more primitive than modern forms, but recognizably shark-like, were diversifying rapidly. Enormous schools of smaller fish moved through the water column. Sea scorpions still persisted in some areas. Coral reefs, larger and more complex than those of the Silurian, provided shelter for vast communities of smaller creatures. It was a rich world, and Dunkleosteus sat at the very top of it. At the same time that Dunkleosteus was dominating the seas, something extraordinary was happening at the water's edge. Certain lineages of lobe-finned fish with muscular, limb-like fins that they used to prop themselves up on the seafloor, were beginning to spend more time in the shallows and on the muddy margins of rivers and swamps. These animals, which include creatures like Tiktaalik, discovered in the Canadian Arctic, were developing the ability to breathe air and support their weight on their fins. They were the ancestors of all land vertebrates. While Dunkleosteus ruled the open sea, these pioneering fish were taking the first tentative steps toward a completely new way of life on land. The Devonian ended in catastrophe around 375 to 359 million years ago. A prolonged series of extinction events, collectively called the Late Devonian Extinction, wiped out a large proportion of marine species. The causes are still debated, but likely include the spread of land plants, which would have dramatically changed river chemistry and oxygen levels in coastal waters, as well as possible asteroid impacts and volcanic activity. The Placoderms, including Dunkleosteus, did not survive. The entire group went extinct at the end of the Devonian, leaving no descendants. An entire chapter of vertebrate evolution closed. But life went on. The survivors, the sharks, the bony fish, the early land vertebrates inherited a world that the Placoderms had helped to shape. And on land, the descendants of those pioneering lobe-finned fish were beginning to diversify into something new. The first true land animals, four-limbed, air-breathing, capable of walking on solid ground, were feeling their way into a world that had never known footsteps before. The age of marine giants was giving way to something entirely new. For the first 4 billion years of life's existence on Earth, the land was essentially empty of animal life. Plants had begun colonizing it during the Ordovician and Silurian periods, slowly spreading across the bare rock and creating the first thin soils. Insects and other small arthropods followed the plants onto land, but large animals, anything with a backbone, were entirely absent from the land surface until the Devonian period, when the first tentative four-limbed vertebrates began to drag themselves out of shallow water and onto the muddy margins of rivers and swamps. These first land vertebrates are called tetrapods, four-limbed animals, and they include the ancestors of every amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal that has ever lived on land. The earliest of them, creatures like Acanthostiga and Ichthyostica from around 365 million years ago, were not fully terrestrial. They had limbs, proper limbs, with wrists and ankles and digits, but those limbs were probably used more for moving through dense aquatic vegetation than for walking on dry land. They breathed air, but they were still closely tied to water for reproduction, as most amphibians are today. They were transitional creatures living between two worlds. The Carboniferous period, which began around 359 million years ago, gave these early land vertebrates a world that was almost overwhelmingly rich. The climate was warm and wet. Vast swamp forests stretched across the equatorial regions of what would later become Europe and North America. The trees of these forests were not like modern trees. They were giant horsetails and club mosses, some reaching 30 or 40 meters tall, with scaly bark and no proper wood in the modern sense. Their roots and trunks, when they died and fell into the swampy water, did not fully rot because the microbes capable of breaking down lignin had not yet fully evolved. They accumulated as peat, which over millions of years became coal. The coal seams that powered the Industrial Revolution are the compressed remains of Carboniferous forests. In these dense, humid forests, animal life was flourishing in new and astonishing ways. Insects, freed from the water and with access to abundant plant material, had diversified enormously. Millipedes grew to lengths of over 2 meters, the largest land arthropods in Earth's history. Giant dragonfly-like insects called griffinflies, with wingspans of up to 70 centimeters, patrolled the air. The high oxygen levels of the Carboniferous atmosphere, perhaps 35%, compared to today's 21%, allowed arthropods to grow to sizes impossible in the modern world, because their simple respiratory systems could support larger bodies when oxygen was more abundant. And among all this teeming insect life moved the early tetrapods, growing in diversity, growing in capability, beginning to exploit a world that was full of food and opportunity. Some remained tied to the water, like the amphibians of today, but others were evolving something new and crucial: the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg, with its protective membranes and tough outer shell, freed its possessors from the need to lay eggs in water. An animal with an amniotic egg could live its entire life on dry land. It could colonize deserts, mountaintops, dry plains, anywhere at all. The amniote, the group that includes reptiles, birds, and mammals, was born, and with it came the possibility of true terrestrial dominance. The early amniotes were small, lizard-like animals at first, feeding on insects and other small creatures in the undergrowth of the Carboniferous forest. But their descendants would grow. They would diversify. And in the Permian period that followed the Carboniferous, they would produce the first truly great land predators, animals whose size, speed, and ferocity rivaled anything the seas had produced. The land was no longer just a fringe habitat, a marginal zone between the productive ocean and the empty continent. It was becoming an arena in its own right, and the creatures evolving within it were becoming increasingly dangerous. Among the first significant land predators of the early Carboniferous and early Permian were the temnospondyls, large amphibian-like animals that occupied the role of top aquatica predator in freshwater environments. Some grew to impressive sizes, with wide, flat heads, powerful jaws, and the ability to lunge at prey from shallow water. Eryops was one of the better-known temnospondyls, a barrel-bodied, short-limbed animal about 2 meters long, built low to the ground and capable of powerful bursts of movement. It was not fast, but it did not need to be. It was an ambush predator, lying in wait at the water's edge for prey to come within range. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian around 299 million years ago, the climate began to dry. The vast swamp forests retreated. The world became more varied. Some areas remained wet and forested, others became seasonally dry or even arid. This diversity of environments drove a new wave of evolutionary experimentation in the land vertebrates. Different lineages adapted to different habitats, and the competition between them drove rapid change. From one particularly successful lineage of early amniotes, the Synapsids, came a series of increasingly large and formidable predators that would dominate the land for the next 50 million years. The Synapsids are significant beyond their role as Permian predators because they are our ancestors. Every mammal alive today, including every human being, is a synapsid. The lineage that produced the great Permian predators also eventually produced us. When you look at the skull of a great Permian predator and see the single opening behind the eye socket that defines a synapsid skull, you are looking at a feature shared with your own skull, buried beneath layers of evolutionary modification. The monsters of the Permian are our distant relatives. Their story is, in the deepest sense, part of our own, and the greatest of those monsters were still to come. The Permian world was building toward something spectacular and terrifying. The synapsids were growing larger, faster, and more capable with each passing million years. It's the first true apex land predators in the history of the Earth. Animals that make lions and tigers look modest by comparison were about to appear. Their name was Dimetrodon, and after Dimetrodon would come something even more formidable. Something with saber teeth, something that looked, in the dim light of an ancient dawn, disturbingly like a nightmare given flesh and bone. Of all the prehistoric creatures that most people mistake for dinosaurs, Dimetrodon is probably the most common victim of that confusion. It appears in toy sets alongside Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops. It shows up in documentaries about the age of dinosaurs. But Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. It was not even closely related to dinosaurs, but it lived more than 40 million years before the first dinosaur appeared. And in terms of its evolutionary relationships, it is actually more closely related to you than it is to any dinosaur that ever lived. Dimetrodon is one of your ancestors. A distant, monstrous, sail-backed ancestor, but an ancestor nonetheless. Dimetrodon lived during the early to middle Permian period, roughly 295 to 272 million years ago. It was a member of the Synapsids, the great lineage of amniotes that would eventually give rise to mammals. More specifically, it belonged to a group called the Placoderms, the earliest and most primitive of the synapsid groups. The Placoderms were the dominant large vertebrates of the early Permian, and Dimetrodon was the largest and most formidable predator among them. In the ecosystems of early Permian North America and Europe, it had no serious rival. The most immediately striking thing about Dimetrodon is its sail, the tall ridge of elongated spines rising from its back, connected by a membrane of skin to form a dramatic fin-like structure that ran from the base of its neck to the base of its tail. The function of this sail has been debated by scientists for over a century. The most popular explanation is thermoregulation, using the large surface area of the sail to absorb heat from the sun in the morning, warming the body faster than an animal without a sail could manage, and then radiating excess heat in the heat of the day. If this is correct, Dimetrodon was capable of controlling its body temperature more efficiently than most of its contemporaries, giving it an edge in activity and speed during the cooler parts of the day. But the sail may have served other purposes too. It was a striking visual signal, impossible to miss, hard to ignore. In a world where visual communication was already important for animals with good eyesight, the sail may have functioned as a display structure used to attract mates or intimidate rivals. Some researchers have suggested it may have played a role in species recognition, allowing Dimetrodon individuals to identify others of their own kind at a distance, whatever its precise function, and it may have served multiple purposes simultaneously. The sail made Pterygotus one of the most visually distinctive animals of the Permian world. Strip away the sail, however, and what you have is a formidable predator on its own merits. Dimetrodon grew to lengths of up to 4.5 meters in the largest species, roughly the size of a large saltwater crocodile. It walked on 4 sprawling legs, low to the ground, in a posture similar to a modern lizard, but with a slightly more upright gait than most reptiles. Skull was deep and laterally compressed, bearing teeth of 2 distinctly different types: long, stabbing canine-like teeth at the front for seizing and killing prey, and smaller, cutting teeth at the sides for slicing through flesh. This differentiation of teeth, called heterodonty, was a synapsid innovation that would eventually become one of the defining features of mammals. The diet of Dimetrodon was almost certainly varied. Large individuals would have been capable of taking on the biggest prey available in their environment: large amphibians, other synapsids, perhaps even other Dimetrodon individuals. Smaller juveniles would have eaten insects, small vertebrates, and whatever else they could catch. The ecosystems of the early Permian included large temnospondyl amphibians, various plant-eating synapsids, and a range of smaller animals. Dimetrodon occupied the top of this food chain with apparent authority. Its fossils are found abundantly in the red beds of Texas and Oklahoma, which represent ancient floodplain environments where many different animals lived and died together. What makes Dimetrodon scientifically fascinating beyond its role as a predator is what it tells us about the trajectory of synapsid evolution. Its differentiated teeth, its somewhat more upright posture than typical reptiles, and various features of its skull and skeleton all point in the direction that evolution was heading toward the increasingly mammal-like animals of the later Permian. Dimetrodon itself was still quite primitive by mammalian standards, but in its lineage lay the seeds of warm-bloodedness, of complex teeth, of the physiological sophistication that would eventually produce the diverse and successful mammals of the modern world. After Dimetrodon, the synapsid lineage continued to evolve rapidly. The Placoderms gave way to a more advanced group called the Therapsids around 270 million years ago. The Therapsids were, in almost every measurable way, more capable animals than the Placoderms that preceded them. They had more upright postures, legs positioned more directly beneath the body, rather than sprawling to the sides. Their metabolisms were probably higher, suggesting they were closer to warm-bloodedness. Their teeth were more complex and more specialized. Their brains were larger relative to their body size. They were, in short, better animals. And among the Therapsids, the most spectacular, the most terrifying, the most extraordinary were the Gorgonopsids. The Gorgonopsids were the apex predators of the later Permian, and they represent a high point in the evolution of land predators before the dinosaurs. They were fast, they were large, they had saber teeth that make the canines of a modern lion look modest, and they lived in a world that was itself becoming increasingly dramatic, a world heading, though its inhabitants could not know it, toward the greatest catastrophe in the history of life. The Gorgonopsids were the kings of a world that was about to end. But before the end, they ruled with absolute authority. And to understand just how completely they ruled, we need to spend time with them. We need to walk alongside them in the ancient landscape of the late Permian Earth, to see what they hunted and how they hunted it, to understand why they were so successful and why, despite that success, they could not survive what was coming. The Gorgonopsids deserve a segment of their own, because what they were is truly extraordinary. Imagine standing in a landscape 260 million years ago. The air is warm and dry. The sky above is the same blue it has always been, scattered with clouds that look no different from clouds today. But the world around you is unlike anything you would recognize. The plants are strange, seed ferns and primitive conifers, nothing with a flower, nothing with broad, flat leaves in the modern sense. The ground is cracked and reddish. In the distance, a herd of large, barrel-bodied animals moves slowly through the vegetation, cropping low-growing plants with broad, beak-like mouths. These are Dicynodonts, the most successful plant eaters of the Permian world, strange, two-tusked creatures that look like a cross between a tortoise and a pig. In watching them from the shade of a low tree, absolutely still, is something that makes every instinct you possess scream a warning. It is long and lean, perhaps 2.5 meters from nose to tail. Its legs are positioned more directly beneath its body than a crocodile's, giving it a more upright, dog-like stance. Its head is large relative to its body, deep and narrow, and when it opens its mouth, just slightly, casting the air with a flicker of its tongue. You can see why everything in this landscape gives it a wide berth. The canine teeth at the front of its upper jaw are enormous. They project well below the lower jaw, even when the mouth is closed, gleaming curved daggers of enamel, each one longer than your hand. This is a Gorgonopsid, and it is one of the most formidable land predators that has ever existed. The Gorgonopsids were Therapsids, members of the Synapsid lineage that was trending steadily toward the mammal-like condition. They first appeared around 270 million years ago and diversified rapidly into a range of body sizes, from animals the size of a large dog to creatures the size of a bear or small hippo. They were the dominant large predators of the late Permian for around 20 million years. In that time, they evolved alongside their prey, developing the weapons and the physiology needed to bring down the large, tough-skinned Dicynodonts and other large herbivores that formed the bulk of their diet. The saber teeth, the feature that makes Gorgonopsids so immediately striking, were not simply large versions of normal canine teeth. They were specialized killing tools. In the largest Gorgonopsids, like Inostrancevia from what is now Russia, the upper saber teeth could reach 15 centimeters or more in length. They were slightly curved, with serrated edges, designed for slicing through flesh and penetrating deep into the bodies of prey animals. Scientists who have studied the jaw mechanics of Gorgonopsids believe they used a specific killing technique, driving the saber teeth into the throat or back of the neck of their prey, severing major blood vessels and causing rapid death from blood loss. It is a technique similar to that used by saber-toothed cats millions of years later, an example of evolution arriving at the same solution to the same problem twice. Inostrancevia deserves particular attention because it represents the largest and most formidable gorgonopsid known. It grew to lengths of around 3.5 meters and weights estimated at around 300 kilograms, roughly the size of a large male lion, though more robustly built. Its skull alone was around 45 centimeters long. Saber teeth were among the largest of any gorgonopsid, and it lived alongside some of the largest decenodonts of the Permian creatures, like Scutosaurus, a heavily built, armored plant eater that could weigh a ton or more. That Inostrancevia regularly hunted animals of this size is suggested by the fossil evidence. Inostrancevia remains have been found in close association with the bones of large decenodonts, bearing tooth marks consistent with gorgonopsid predation. What was the gorgonopsid's world like? The late Permian Earth was in some ways recognizable and in others deeply strange. The supercontinent of Pangaea was fully assembled, all of the world's land pushed together into one enormous mass, a cot. The interior of this continent was hot and arid, a vast desert at the heart of the world, unreachable by moisture from the surrounding ocean. Around the edges of Pangaea, where rainfall was higher and rivers ran reliably, life was richer. The floodplains and river valleys of what is now southern Africa, Russia, other regions were where the great Permian ecosystems flourished, where the decenodont herds grazed, where the gorgonopsids hunted, where the full drama of late Permian life played out. The gorgonopsids were not the only predators of this world. The archosaurs, the group that would eventually give rise to both dinosaurs and crocodilians, were beginning to appear in the fossil record. Some early archosaur-related creatures were active predators. Smaller, predatory thromsids occupied the niches below the gorgonopsids in the food chain. And the temnospondyl amphibians still lurked in rivers and lakes, dangerous to anything that came to drink at the water's edge. The Permian world was a fully realized ecosystem, complex and layered, with predators and prey locked in the endless evolutionary dance that has characterized animal life since the Cambrian. The gorgonopsids showed signs of physiology that went beyond what we normally associate with reptiles. The structure of their limb bones suggests active, energetic animals. Their upright posture required significant muscular effort to maintain, suggesting a metabolism higher than that of a crocodile or lizard. Some researchers believe they may have been fully warm-blooded, or at least capable of generating significant internal heat through their activity. If so, they were among the earliest vertebrates to achieve this, a trait that would be refined and perfected by their mammalian descendants. And then everything ended. The Great Dying, the Permian Triassic mass extinction, arrived around 252 million years ago with a ferocity that staggers comprehension. Volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released carbon dioxide on a scale that dwarfs anything in human experience, triggering a cascade of environmental changes that unraveled the ecosystems of the late Permian with terrifying speed. Temperatures soared, the oceans acidified and lost their oxygen. On land, the vegetation died back. The decenodonts, the great herds of plant eaters that had sustained the gorgonopsids, declined catastrophically. And without their prey, the gorgonopsids followed. Not a single gorgonopsid survived the Great Dying. The entire lineage, 20 million years of evolution, a dynasty of predators unmatched in their time, was erased. The saber teeth that had brought down the giants of the Permian were gone. The land that they had dominated was left almost empty. And in that emptied world, after millions of years of slow recovery, new predators would arise. But they would be very different from anything the Permian had known. The age of the gorgonopsids was over. The age of the archosaurs was about to begin. The world that emerged from the Great Dying was not simply a damaged version of the Permian world. It was something fundamentally different, impoverished, simplified, strange in a way that only a world recovering from catastrophe can be strange. 96% of marine species had gone extinct. Perhaps 70% of land vertebrate species had disappeared. The ecosystems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build had been dismantled in what was, geologically speaking, an instant. What remained was a rump of life, scattered and struggling in a world that was still hot, still acidic, still chemically disrupted by the ongoing volcanic activity that had triggered the extinction in the first place. The early Triassic, the period immediately following the Great Dying, is one of the strangest intervals in the fossil record. What you find is a world in shock. The diversity of fossils drops dramatically. The variety of species in any given location is thin. The animals that survived tend to be small, generalized, and opportunistic. Large predators are almost entirely absent at first because there simply was not enough prey to sustain them. The food chains had to be rebuilt from the bottom up, and that took time. It took millions of years for ecosystems to recover, even partially, from what had happened. Among the survivors on land were a few Synapsid lineages. The group that had produced the Gorgonopsids still had some members, smaller and more modest than their spectacular Permian predecessors. The Dicenodonts, despite being devastated by the extinction, were not entirely eliminated. Some species survived, and they would diversify again in the Triassic, filling the plant-eating niches that were available in the recovering world. The temnospondyl amphibians also survived, and some would grow to impressive sizes in the early Triassic, occupying the top predator roles in aquatic environments while the land was still recovering. But the survivors that mattered most, the ones whose descendants would inherit the Triassic world, were the Archosaurs. The Archosaurs had existed in the Permian, but had been relatively minor players, overshadowed by the dominant Synapsids. In the emptied world of the early Triassic, with the Gorgonopsids gone and the other great Synapsid predators eliminated, the Archosaurs found themselves with an opportunity that had never existed before. Open niches, empty ecosystems, a world full of food and almost nothing capable of stopping them from taking it. The Archosaurs split very early in their history into two great groups. One lineage, called the Pseudotsuchians or the Crocodilian line, would eventually give rise to the Crocodilians of today, those armored, aquatic ambush predators that have remained relatively unchanged in their basic design for over 200 million years, which is perhaps the greatest testament to their effectiveness as predators that nature has ever produced. The other lineage, called the Ornithoderans or the bird line, would eventually give rise to the pterosaurs and the dinosaurs. These two groups were the heirs to the Permian world. And in the Triassic, before the dinosaurs rose to dominance, it was the crocodilian line Archosaurs that were the most formidable predators on land. The early and middle Triassic were dominated by an extraordinary variety of Archosaurs that most people have never heard of. Animals like Postosuchus, a large, upright walking predator from what is now North America, perhaps 4 to 5 meters long, with a deep skull, powerful jaws, and serrated teeth. Postosuchus walked with an almost fully erect posture, more like a large predatory dinosaur than a crocodile, and it occupied the top predator role in its ecosystem with evident authority. It was not a dinosaur, it was a Rauisuchian, one of the crocodilian line Archosaurs, but in its general appearance and ecological role, it anticipated the great theropod dinosaurs that would come later. Alongside Postosuchus and his relatives were other remarkable Archosaurs, Hedosaurs, heavily armored, pig-like animals rooted through the vegetation as plant eaters, Phytosaurs, which looked astonishingly like modern crocodiles, despite being only distantly related to them, lurked in rivers and lakes. Early dinosaurs, still small and not yet dominant, scurried in the margins of these ecosystems, waiting for their chance. The Triassic was a world of fierce competition between multiple groups of Archosaurs, each trying to establish itself in the recovering post-Permian landscape. What is striking about this period is how close we came to a very different world. In the Middle Triassic, the Synapsids, our own ancestors, were still a significant presence. the competition between synapsids and archosaurs had gone differently. The dominant land animals for the past 250 million years might have been mammals, not dinosaurs. The world we live in might have arrived much sooner, but it did not go that way. The archosaurs, for reasons that are still not entirely understood, outcompeted the synapsids in almost every large-body ecological role. The synapsids were pushed into the small, nocturnal margins of the ecosystem, and the archosaurs, first the crocodilian line, and then the dinosaurs, took over the land. Then, at the end of the Triassic, another mass extinction struck. Around 201 million years ago, the breakup of Pangaea triggered enormous volcanic eruptions along what would become the central Atlantic Ocean. Carbon dioxide flooded the atmosphere again. Temperatures rose. Many of the dominant crocodilian line archosaurs died out. The edosaurs went extinct. The phytosaurs disappeared. Pastosuchus and its relatives vanished. And in the emptied world that followed, the dinosaurs, which had been biding their time, diversifying quietly in the background, finally had their moment. The age of the non-dinosaurian archosaurs was over. The age of the dinosaurs was beginning, and with it would come the most spectacular chapter in the history of land life. A chapter filled with giants, with feathered hunters, with armored tanks and long-necked browsers, with creatures so extraordinary that we are still, hundreds of millions of years later, struggling to fully comprehend what they were. But before we get there, we should spend a moment with one more remarkable creature, an animal from the very doorstep of the dinosaur age that represents one of the most dramatic predators of the Triassic world. The late Triassic was a world in transition. The great extinction at the end of the Permian had cleared the landscape. And for the first 50 million years of the Triassic, different groups of animals had competed to fill the empty niches. By the late Triassic, the archosaurs had won that competition, and within the archosaurs, two groups were locked in a contest that would shape the next 200 million years. On one side were the crocodilian line archosaurs, established, diverse, and formidable. On the other were the dinosaurs, newer, faster evolving, and increasingly successful. The outcome of this contest was not inevitable. For much of the late Triassic, it could have gone either way. The late Triassic world, roughly 230 to 201 million years ago, was dominated in terms of large predators by the Rhesuchians, the most formidable of the crocodilian line archosaurs. These were large, upright walking animals with powerful bodies, deep skulls, and serrated teeth. They ranged from about 3 to over 6 meters in length in the largest species. They occupied every large predator niche on the landmasses of late Triassic Pangaea, and they were, by any measure, impressive animals. A late Triassic ecosystem without Rhesuchians would be like a modern African savanna without lions. The whole ecological structure of the community depended on their presence at the top. Saurasuchus, from what is now South America, was one of the largest and most formidable. It grew to around 7 meters in length and probably weighed over 300 kilograms. Its skull was large and deep. Its teeth were serrated and recurved. Its legs were positioned in a semi-erect posture that allowed for more efficient locomotion than the sprawling gait of a crocodile. Saurasuchus would have been the dominant predator of its environment, an apex killer that nothing in its ecosystem could challenge, and it lived alongside some of the earliest dinosaurs, including early sauropod relatives, which, at this stage, were still modest in size, and not yet the giants they would later become. The early dinosaurs of the late Triassic were mostly small to medium-sized bipedal animals, fast, agile, and intelligent by the standards of their time, but not yet dominant. Creatures like Eurypterids and Eogemeus from Argentina, early Herrerasaurids from South America, and the Coelophysids of North America were the dinosaur fauna of the late Triassic. They were capable hunters of smaller prey, early mammals, lizard-like reptiles, large insects. Some, like the Herrerasaurids, were larger and more formidable, capable of taking on mid-sized prey. But they were not yet competing directly with the Rhesukians for the top predator role. That day was coming, but it had not arrived. The oceans and rivers of the late Triassic had their own formidable predators. Phytosaurs, those crocodile-like animals that were not actually crocodilians, but had converged on the same body plan independently, were major aquatic predators in rivers and lakes across Pangaea. Some grew to lengths of 6 meters or more. Their nostrils were positioned on a raised bump near the eyes, rather than at the tip of the snout, as in modern crocodilians, which is one of the key ways to distinguish them from the true crocodilians that would replace them. In their rivers and lakes, they were dominant, eating fish, early amphibians, and anything else that came within reach of their long jaws. One of the most remarkable predators of the late Triassic was not a large archosaur at all, but a large temnospondyl amphibian, a survivor from the older world that had managed to persist through the turmoil of the early Triassic and was still a significant presence in aquatic environments. Mastodonsaurus was one of the largest. Its skull alone could reach over 1 meter in length, and the whole animal may have stretched to 4 or 5 meters. It was a flat-headed, wide-mouthed ambush predator that lurked in shallow water and seized prey with a rapid lunge. In the swamps and river systems of the Triassic, it was one of the most dangerous things you could encounter. The skies of the late Triassic were also becoming increasingly interesting. The pterosaurs, the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight, had appeared by at least 228 million years ago, and by the late Triassic, they were diverse and well established. Early pterosaurs were mostly small, with wingspans of around half a meter to 1 meter, and they probably fed on insects and small vertebrates. They were not yet the giants they would become in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, but their presence in the skies meant that the aerial niche was already occupied, and the dinosaurs that would eventually give rise to birds faced, from the very beginning, competition from these flying reptiles. The mammals, small, mostly nocturnal insectivores, descendants of the synapsid survivors of the Great Dying, were also present in the late Triassic world. They were not prominent, they were not spectacular. Did not hunt large prey or compete with the archosaurs for the dominant roles in the ecosystem. But they were there, quietly persisting in the shadows, filling small niches that the archosaurs had left unclaimed. They would wait in those small niches for a very long time, but eventually their patience would be rewarded. The end-Triassic extinction, when it came, was selective in ways that permanently altered the balance of power on land. Cuchians were devastated. The large crocodilian-lined predators that had dominated the land for 50 million years were eliminated almost entirely. The phytosaurs disappeared. The etosaurs went extinct. The large temnospondyls were severely reduced, but the dinosaurs survived. The pterosaurs survived, and the small mammals survived. Why some groups made it and others did not is a question scientists are still working to fully answer. But the outcome was clear and decisive. The world that emerged from the end-Triassic extinction was a world in which dinosaurs would be the dominant large land animals. The age of the great pre-dinosaurian predators was over. Anomalocaris, the sea scorpions, Dunkleosteus, Dimetrodon, the Gorgonopsids, the Rhesukians, each in turn had ruled their world. Each had been the most feared creature in their ecosystem, and each had eventually given way to something new. Now it was the dinosaurs' turn, and what they would do with their opportunity, the scale, the variety, the sheer spectacular drama of the dinosaur age would surpass even the remarkable worlds that had come before. Looking back across 500 million years of predator history, a question naturally arises. What made these animals so successful? Or was it about Anomalocaris, or Dunkleosteus, or the Gorgonopsids, or the Rhesukians that allowed them to reach the top of their respective food chains and stay there for millions of years? The answer is not simple, because each of these animals was successful for different reasons, in different environments, at different moments in the history of life. But there are patterns, or principles that recur across all of these very different creatures. And understanding those principles tells us something profound about the nature of predation itself.